Hello, backend engineers. If you're a backend engineer and you're looking for good tips on how to work on the front end and get your UI skills sharpened, this is exactly the video for you. So before we get started, I'm just gonna tell you that you have to watch this video till the end because not only we talk about what's important for UI as a backend engineer, but then also we'll go through a whole application in which you learn a lot of things about how to work with the front end. So let's talk about front end or UI for backenders. And you're gonna go from noob to pro. Maybe. We'll see. So first of all, I want you to know who I am. So I am Mohammad Ahsan. I'm originally from Pakistan. I'm working at Salt as a head instructor and also a software architect. I'm a Google acknowledged expert in Angular, which means that I get to have a profile on developers.google.com and Google can recommend me to different people for Angular expertise. I'm also the author of the Angular cookbook and I'm working on the second edition, so I'm really excited to get it out. If you want to see my articles or my work in general, go to codewithsn.dev and you'll find my social links as well. So just follow me. So, UI for backenders. What the front end in general? First of all, let's talk about the basics. Where do we draw the line between the front end and the back end? That's a really difficult question, and a lot of influencers, especially tech influencers, they have different opinions on it. If you ask me, having an experience of over 10 years working as a full stack engineer, I would say that when you try to get your assets or resources from the backend, the moment your browser gets it, after that you start your front end. Now, again, as I said, it's a very gray line because sometimes you are in the process where you are server side rendering your things and then you have to think about the front end there as well. But I would generally say for the most people, as soon as the browser has rendered your application or has got your HTML from the backend, that's where your work starts. And even before fetching as well. For example, you might want to prioritize some images or some assets so your page loads faster. That also comes in the front end. But let's talk about what really happens when you try to enter a URL into our browser. What really happens? So your browser, that is your front end, essentially first tries to go to your server and says, hey, give me the HTML, give me the JavaScript, give me the CSS and the images. So everything I want, please give it to me so I can render those things on the UI. When you're trying to do that, the server may decide to do one of these things. It could just send back a static HTML, which is static site generation, which is usually the case from the beginning of time. So we have had HTML, JavaScript, CSS files. Essentially, you can send that back. Or you have server-side rendering, or you have incremental site regeneration. But you are a backend engineer, so you might already know some of those. After the browser has loaded your HTML, then the JavaScript kicks in and we call it the client-side rendering. And that is heavily where the front-end engineers work. Let's talk about a UI example. So let's talk about this application, which is my product. So what happens here is we have a distribution of UI. Now take a couple of seconds and actually see what components do you see in this particular page. Now as a backend engineer, you might, for example, you have the header right here. You have a button here that could be a component. Then you have this pulse meter right there. There's nothing here, but there is supposed to be a pulse meter here. Then you also have this white box, which is essentially the whole feedback form. Now, this application essentially allows organizers or even speakers to create sessions and get feedback real time while the talk or the session is happening via this application. And the users can say, or the viewers can say, hey, the pace is good, the pace is too fast, too slow, and they also can add a comment. Now, if you distribute this component further, the feedback component, you also have the pace checker, you also have the comment box and whatnot. So if I go here, this is how you would distribute them. You have the header component, you have the footer component where you have these reactions, then you have the pulse meter, then you have the feedback form, which can be distributed into paste selector and comment box. So this is an example of what the distribution of the UI could look like. Now let's go and study some details. So let's suppose you have a header component and you have a user card. So this application that we are going to build is going to have a bunch of books. Each book would have a card for it. So it would have the book title, it would have the book author. That's pretty much it. So in our application, we'll have the header, the footer, and a bunch of book cards. Once you go or click a particular book card, then you're taken to the detail page of that particular book. And then you can see the title and author, which is essentially going to be the same component as this one. And you're going to see some text as well. Now, in this application, you're going to learn a couple of tips and tricks. First of all, how to build the UI. Secondly, how to reuse the components on the front end. And third, we're going to make a single page application, but with routing. So we're going to have a list route and also a detailed route. Easy peasy. Sounds good. So what I'm going to do actually for this front end application is we are going to use something called Vite and React. So React is obviously famous. Everybody knows that. But we are going to use Vite to generate a React application instead of the create React app, which was used before. I personally like Vite quite a lot. So I'm going to go to vitejs.dev. And in here, you can essentially go to get started. And in here, you can essentially go here where it says React.js. Now, if you click that, it starts, I think, in the online browser, but you can run this command. So npm create Vite at latest, and this creates a new application. Now, I want to show you an application that I already have, which is a minimalistic application that I've created using Express.js and Node.js. So essentially what this does is that you have a server. So if I run npm start, I believe that's the command I'm using. Yes, that is. So I have an application which has a bunch of routes. So if I zoom in a bit, you can see that we have a get route which just says hello world. So if I try to make a curl request, it would do the same. I'm going to use this sort of extension, which is Rapid API client, but I've heard that Thunder client is really good as well. So you can use that as well. But essentially, if I go to localhost 3000, then it will just say hello world because this route would trigger. So if I go back to my app, I go here, I say localhost 3000 and hit enter. You can see the hello world right here. And then we have a get route for the books. So I can also say slash books, and then I'll get an empty array. So I get a response with the books key having an array of no books at all because I don't have the books at the moment, but we will create those. And then we also have a route for posting a new book, which means that I should be able to post new books. What this does is that it expects a request body containing the title and the author. If we don't provide that, it's gonna throw an error. If we provide those, then it's going to create a new book with an ID using this little function here, which generates a random or a unique UUID, and then essentially, or unique user ID, not user ID, UUID, unique ID. Then what we want to do is we want to just add that into the books array, and then we just send back the newly created book that we just created. So I can go here and do the same thing. So if I go here, hit send, you can see there's no books. I could go here and add a new book. So for example, if I say hello world SN, it will create a new one. Now you can see I've created one. If I go here, hit the send, now you can see I have one of those. I can add another one. I could say hello world 2, hit send. If I go here and try this again, you can see now we have hello world 2 here as well. So now I've got two books, and I can also verify this here as well. Now you can see I've got two books. So our backend API is working. Now the front end has to be created and has to use all of that. So what I want to do now is we have copied the command, which was npm create Vite at latest. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to call this application backend rocks because I thought of it and it sounded cool. I think you'll agree. If you do, write in the comments, does backend really rock or no? We're going to call this BR app or backend rocks application. You can also call it BRFE if you feel fancy, but I'm going to just use this. Then I'm going to go with React, and I'm also going to use TypeScript because I love TypeScript so far. Now that we have created this, we can just do code BR app, which will open this into VS Code, but you can essentially use whatever editor you like. We want to actually run npm install, so the dependencies are installed for this little guy. So we can simply say npm install, and then we don't have to leave our window, hopefully. So once this is created, you will see that the source folder itself contains the app tsx, which is essentially a TypeScript JSX, and it contains the HTML or what will render when we run this application or this front-end application. The main file of React is main.tsx. This is where React says, hey, try to find this guy called root in the index HTML, which is right here, and then add React inside here. So render everything that I'm telling you to render right inside this div. So what this does is that it goes here and says, hey, I'm going to try to find this guy with the ID root, and then I'm going to render this app component inside. So this is what it's trying to do. After that, you see whatever is in this particular HTML, you see it being rendered there. Now that we have this installed, we can simply say npm run dev, which comes from the package.json, and in here we're running Vite, which essentially just runs the Vite server at localhost 5173. Let's open this and see what happens. So here you can see that by default, this is how it looks. But what I also want to do is I don't want to write all the CSS by myself. So I'm going to use one of the most famous frameworks today for working with CSS, and that is Tailwind CSS. So what you can do is that you can go to Tailwind CSS. If you go to the home page, get started, framework guides, you will find Vite right here. So it says my project, blah, blah, blah. I've already created the Vite project, so we don't need to do that, but we need to do this one. So we are going to copy this. We're going to go and open a new tab right here, and then we are going to install these packages. So this includes post CSS and also Tailwind CSS itself. So Tailwind CSS, post CSS, auto prefixer. The Tailwind CSS is essentially the library that we're trying to use. Post CSS is essentially a processor which takes Tailwind CSS and then converts it into normal CSS and adds a bunch of other things. And the auto prefixer is used essentially for converting regular CSS for cross browser. So it prefixes some of the things to make it work cross browser. Now that we have this, let's go and initiate this one. So this creates a Tailwind CSS configuration right here. And with that, I would also recommend you to go to the extensions and search for Tailwind. And then you will find the Tailwind CSS official extension, which is this one from Tailwind Labs. You have to install it because then you can do this. When you type, you can actually see the colors and whatnot. So that's really interesting and that's really helpful. So now that we have this, you can essentially see that I can go here and say class. And then if I say bg dash, and now you can see that I can see all these colors or recommendations. So bg red. So this is really, really helpful. So do install the extension to have a really good developer experience. Now that we have this, we have to update the content to this. So I'm going to go inside the Tailwind config.js, which we have just created via this command, npx tailwind init p. So here, I'm just going to paste this guy. So everything inside the source folder that is a JavaScript, TypeScript, JSX, or TSX is going to work with Tailwind CSS. That's what this is saying. Now that we have this, we can go to index CSS, which is right here. And then on the top, we can add Tailwind CSS and save this. And that's pretty much it. Now, if I go back to my Vite app, which is supposed to be right here, and if I refresh, you see there's nothing happening because we need to restart our server in order for Tailwind to basically run. So let's see. Once this runs, we're going to go back to our application and some things might be broken like this. Now you can see that this is like broken, so to say. So what we are going to do is we are going to actually remove everything that is inside the app component, and we can just say, for example, something like h1 y h2 actually. So h1, and then we can say welcome to Salt, for example. And I'm going to remove React logo, Vite logo, and I'm also going to remove this and this as well. So this is pretty much what we want. So if I go here now, you can see welcome to Salt. Awesome. Now that we have this, let's have a look at the CSS file. So we have some things that are already set up, but we don't really want them. And the reason for that is that now you can see everything is actually centered. We don't want that. If I go back to our Exali draw, we want a header on top, we want the footer on the bottom, and then we have some content. So we don't really want all the things to be at the center because then the header cannot go to the top or bottom. So from app CSS, remove the max width. We can also remove margin 0 auto, padding, and even text align. So I'm going to remove all of that. Logo, we don't need that. Logo spin, not really. Card, not really. And read the docs, no. So essentially everything, just remove all of it. Now that we have removed it, I'm going to actually bring this closer here. And now you can see welcome to Salt. This is still towards the center. And that is because we have index CSS, which also has some interesting things right here. So here we are having some fonts. I don't really care about those at the moment. With the A tags, I'm going to remove this style. The body having display flex is what's causing this magic right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove display flex, this, minimum width 320 pixel. I'm going to keep this for now, and the height 100 view edge. Yes, I'm going to keep that as well. So now you can see that it looks pretty nice, and this is what we want. So I'm having the zoom for my screen to 150, but you can essentially do a control mouse scroll up down or command mouse scroll up down to zoom in or out, or you can just click here. So now that we have this, we also have H1 having some styles. We have buttons doing some magic here. I'm going to remove the styles from H1. We'll see about the buttons, but we can take care of that later. It's fine. All right, now we have this. Let's start creating components. So we talked about having a header and a footer. So let's create those first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a component. And now we're talking about what the structure should be for your applications in React. So we will have some pages and we will have some components. So first of all, what I want to do is I want to create a folder called components. And then inside here, I can create either a folder for each component or just the file for each component. Since this is a really small applications and I don't imagine my components needing more nested components, I'm going to keep this simple. Let's keep this simple. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say header.tsx. Then what I want to do is I want to say RAFCE, and essentially this is an extension that I'm using. I think it's called React Snippets. So you can go to React Snippets. And in here, you should be able to see the extension that I'm using. It's this one, ES7 React Redux React Native Snippets. This is what I'm using. Super handy. Or you can use this one, like 3.1 million installs. Yes, maybe that one. But I'm using the other one. All right, now that we have this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just save this guy, which is header. This says header. And now to use this component inside my app, I just need to import it and render it. So right here, just before the H1, I'm going to actually say header, and you can see that it is importing from the header component, and I just need to say it like this. And if I save this, go back to my application, which is this guy, you can see the header right here. This header is coming from this div. So I'm going to replace this div and actually build a header. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a header. Inside here, we are going to have the logo. So here we can have a span that says something like, here we can say salt, or we can say backend rocks. And here we have salt. So now you can see right here. Now what I want to do is I want to give some styles. So I can say class name, because React uses class name instead of class. So here I can say, for example, BG, Indigo. And if you don't see the suggestions, on Windows, I can do command space, not command space, control space. On I think on MacBook as well, you have control space as well. So control space on both. So BG, Indigo, you can see it doesn't show me anything. So if I do control space, now it shows it. So I'm going to say, hey, take the 800 one. And if I do this, you can see that now we've got a background. You can also say text white, witty, nope, white. And now we have the text white on that one. We want to say the P or the padding is going to be 4, which means that if you mouse over this, it also shows you that P4 means 1 RAM or 16 pixels. So I want the 16 pixels one. What I don't want is the top and bottom padding. So I'm going to say PX equals to 4, which means that it's going to have left and right only and not on anything on Y. Now, what I also want to do is to give this a height of 64 pixels. So I can use H. I think if I use 8, that is 32. No. If I do 10, I think that's 40. So 12, 48, and 16 is 64. So I can use this, and now you see that we have a really good header. On 150, this is how it looks, and this is how I want it to look. But you can see that now this text is actually not really centered vertically. So what I want to do is I want to use flex here, so I can actually set it on the screen. Now you can just right click here, go to inspect, go to elements, and then you can click this guy, and then you can press this, so you can select the header. Now what I can do is I can type here display flex, and you can see that now it doesn't really do anything. But if I unclick it, mouse over, you see everything on the screen is blue, or this highlighted portion is blue. If I do this, then you see that now some of it is blue and some of it is purple, because now this header is flexible. So what I can do with the flex also is I can say align items center. And if I do this, you'll see that now all the items or this whatever is inside it, which is this span, essentially is center aligned vertically. So you can essentially try to do that as well. Now you can see flex direction, align content, justify content, align items. So you can actually try and see and change this. I really like this feature that they have just added in the debugger. Really handy. You can also say justify content, should it be center, start, and just play around. I want this to be not start. I actually want it to be space between, but I'm going to show you that in a minute. This is what I want, space between, because we also would have a button right here as well. Anyways, I can now copy this because if I refresh, everything is gone, of course, because I am editing here. So I can go back to my header TSX, and in here I can create a header CSS file, or you can add it somewhere else. It is recommended to have the CSS files along with the component. So here I would rather just go and say header, and inside there I can just move this guy. This means I would have to update the app TSX to bring it from header, which makes sense. And then I can also add a new file called header.css. So header.css. Now, one of the things I could do is I could say, hey, this header is actually going to have the CSS. But another thing that I could do, since I'm using Tailwind, is delete this file, move this back, and just use Tailwind CSS. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to delete this guy right here. And then what I can do is update the app TSX. It's already done. Cool. And in the header TSX, now I can say the display is going to be flex, the items is going to be center, and the justify is going to be between. And if I do this, you can see that now it's center aligned and it has the exact same styles which I applied. So if you mouse over this, you can see that here justify between is applied, align item center, and display flex, because we use the flex class, the item center, and justify between. Super handy. Now that we have this, let's also add another span. In here, we are going to actually add a GitHub link. So let's say GitHub. And now you can see the GitHub one is here. So the justify content between essentially makes sure that there's a space between both of them, and they're apart. So they're towards the corner. Okay. And if you mouse over, you can see this purple line. That's the space between, that is empty, unused. Cool. Now that we have the header sorted out, let's also sort out the footer. So if I go ahead and create the same thing, so I'm going to copy this, paste this again, and I can here say footer.tsx, replace this with footer, and here I can maybe just have one thing, and that could be copyright and salt 2023, or actually applied technology Stockholm AP 2023. And now if I render this, you can see that nothing's there because I need to add that to the app. So here I can say now footer, which is coming from the components folder. And now if I save this, you see now we have the header and the footer. Yay! What I don't want in the footer is the GitHub link. What I also don't want in the footer is this guy being left aligned. So I need to change the justify between actually to justify center. And there you go. Now, since I only have one thing here, I could also remove the entire thing and just say text center, which is also a neat trick, but then I wouldn't have this vertically aligned. So let's go back and then apply this nicely. What I also want to do is on this span, I want to say class name, and then I want to use text SM. So we have a smaller text. Awesome. Now this looks really cool, but what happens if I change my dark mode to light mode? So if I go to settings, or if I say dark mode system wide, I could change that to light. And now you can see that now it looks like this. So you do have essentially the same thing here, but if you want the same output on the dark and light, that's really good. But if you want a different one, then we can use Tailwind CSS to define that. Let's say the BG Indigo was for the light mode. So if there's the dark mode, then what we want is we want BG slate, and in here we can have a darker 900, and the text still remains white. So if I go now here to the footer, so I'm already on the footer, but in the header as well, then I can also paste this guy and save. Now, if I go and change this to dark, you can see that automatically the background changed to the dark color that I wanted. Super cool, nice. So what I can do now is I can keep the dark mode because I don't want to hurt my eyes. So I'm going to go back to my code, and now I'm going to fix one little thing, and that is that this should not look like this. We should have the header on top, the footer at the bottom, and everything in the middle. So we want to say that this whole thing should somehow make it possible to have this content take as much space as possible. How do we do that? We're going to go to our app.tsx because this is where we have the root essentially. Or we could go to index.css right here where we had some root styles, as you can see right here. This is not the root actually. This is the root, but this is not the index element or the element with root ID. So what I'm going to do here actually is I'm going to say, hey, come here, and then you can do this root, and then this should be display flex. Now, reality is I can actually use directly Tailwind CSS classes here as well. So I can use something like apply, flex, and then what I can say is if I just do flex, look at this, what happens. So if any element is flexed, that means that everything inside has to be one single row. No, I would say this is actually flex column, which means that now they are on top of each other. Now what I want to say is that this, since is flex, I want this thing, the welcome to sort thingy, to take as much space as possible. But I will not just have a heading there, but I'll have much more things. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go to app.tsx, and inside of this heading, I'm going to have a main here. So we have a header, main, footer. We are using the semantic HTML right here. So what I want to say here is that this main should take as much space as possible. So I can just go here and say flex 1, which means take the maximum space. Now if I go here and refresh, you're going to see that nothing really happens. Now we come to the front end problematic world. If I look at the HTML, you see everything is blue. Super cool. If I look at the root, you see not everything is blue. Not super cool. And that is because this body takes the full height, but this root does not. So we need to add this thing here that says height 100%. When we do this, then this root should take the height 100%. But the body itself does not take the height 100%. So we also need to say height 100%. Or we would have to say that this root actually takes the minimum height of 100 view height. So here, if we go and say minimum height 100 view edge, that fixes the problem. So we don't have to go to the entire tree. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my code, and in here we can say, hey, for the root element, which is inside here, we also want to say minimum height screen, which means minimum height 100 view height, which is the same thing. Now if I apply this, go to my page and refresh, you can see everything works like a charm, no problem at all. The only thing that I'm a bit skeptical about right now is the spacing here versus here. So we want all the spaces to be the same. So this one, since has a padding, if you mouse over this, you're going to notice something interesting. We have a purple area, which is the flex area not being used. We have the blue area where we have some content. We have the green area, which is padding. So the left and right padding are, if you go to compute it, you can see the padding right here, which is 16 pixels. And you can then obviously do the same with this main. This main doesn't have any padding. We need padding. So what we are going to do is we're going to go to our code base, and inside the app.tsx, the main, we can say P4, which means that 16 pixels every side. So if I go back to my app right here, you can see that this one and this one is aligned. So one of the things that really hurt my eyes is if the front-end engineers are not using the spacing and the margins evenly throughout the page, yes, that hurts my eyes. So if you look at this padding from the left and right, this is quite equal to this one because we have the same left and right padding. Now that we have this, let's go into actually implementing the pages. For that, we need to use something called the React router, and we are going to install the router, and then we are going to configure some pages. Let's do that. So I'm going to go to React router. So what we want to use here is the browser router. And this requires us to install this package called React Router DOM. So what we are going to do is we're going to go here to the next terminal. And in here, we're going to install the React Router DOM. So npm install React Router DOM. And this is the most famous package for actually creating routes in React. What we want to do now is we want to have the header and footer on all pages. And we also want to have the main, but inside main, we want to have this router. So what you want to do is you're going to go here and use the browser router. So you're going to come here and paste this guy right here. And then the browser router is going to come from the React Router DOM. The routes is also going to come from the React Router DOM. And in here, this also comes from the same package. Now that we have these implemented, we want to not have this base name at all. We don't want the base name. What we want is by default, we should have a page that is called the books listing page. So we want to render that. And then we'll have a book detail page as well. So what we want to do is to have a books page, and that should render the component. So in here, what you will do is you'll say component, and here you can say books list component, or actually books list page if you want to say it like that, or just say books list, because what we are going to do now is we are going to create a new folder. So here we can say, hey, we have pages, and here we can say books list.tsx RAFCE, and in here now we can just render some books list. So in this particular situation, we want to just go here and import the books list from here. And if I save this, then we should have a new route in place. So let's go to our app and check it out. So if I go back to my browser and if I go to the app, you see there's nothing being rendered here at all, even though we have the header and footer. And that is because the main is not having any routes. However, if I go to books, then you should be able to see the books itself, which is right here, books list. Yay! Now we have a route for books. What we want to do though is someone going to the home page should automatically be routed to books because we don't have any other page at all. So what we can actually use is, I think there is a component that is called is navigate. That's the component. So we need to use navigate, and then we can say replace, and this should be true, and then we can say to, and in here we can define what route this should go to, and here you can say basically to books, and this essentially helps us to to go to the books page. But we also want to say that this particular thing is supposed to be in a route that has a path of wildcard. So in here you're going to say asterisk. So that means anything that is not registered at all. So it could be a 404, it could be some weird link. In any case, we're going to render the books list page or redirect to the books list page. So if I go back to my page now and refresh, let's see what happens. Now this says blah, blah, blah. So this is not a route component. All the children route must be a route. That perfectly makes sense. So if I go back to my application, I can see that we have a route which has a child component, but we should have been using the element for this. And inside here, we should have navigate. So if I refresh this, go back to my app, now you can see we have no errors and this renders as well. Now, if I try to go to the home page, let's see what happens. Boom, you can see that they are forwarding it to the books page. And if I also try something that doesn't exist, it also takes us to the book page. Awesome. This is super cool. Now what I want to do is I want to also create a page for book details. So book details.tsx RAFCE, and I'm going to remove this and just save this. And then what I want to do is an app tsx, I can go ahead and render another route, and that is going to be books slash and then ID. This essentially gives us the possibility of having a parameter which we can use in the book details page later on. Now that we have this, we can save this and then check our second route as well. So now if I go to books slash 123 ABC, you can see that we see the book details here instead of the list. And if I go back, I can see the list, go forward, book details. Cool. Now what we can do is we can also render the information on the UI. So I'm going to go to book details for now. And here I can say const use params. Yeah, use params. So when we use params, we can take out the user ID and then we can render that as well. So here, if this was user ID, we could take out the user ID. So in here, we can go and say, hey, we have the ID coming from the use params, which should come from React Router DOM. And then we can say book details. And here we can just render the ID itself. And this should be like this. And now I can go to my page. And if I go here, refresh, you can see that we are on the book list. If I go forward, 1, 2, 3 ABC, that's coming from the route here. So here you can say DEF, XYZ, and whatever is in the params comes here. This makes it easier for us to get the actual book when we are going to render it like this. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Now that we have this, let's quickly go and implement the cards, which we are going to render on the list page, and we are also going to have the author and the title of the book rendered there. So for that, what we are going to do is we're going to implement first the UI, and then we're going to hook the API call. And this is really important because if you end up in a team where the backend is being implemented and you're supposed to work on the front end and you're like, what? I don't have the APIs. I can't really work. But that's not the case. You can either ask the backend engineers to tell you how the contract looks like or how the JSON object looks like, and you can mock it, or you just go ahead with the UI and build all the features with some hard-coded data. So this is what we are going to do actually now. So what we want to do is, if I go to localhost 3000 books, you can see that we still have the books because the server is still running, but we are going to implement the UI rather than actually implementing the API at the moment. So what I want to do now is I want to go to a site called hyperui.dev, and this has a bunch of cool buttons, cool UI elements, which are actually built for Tailwind CSS. So you can actually go to implement, for example, cards or grids for that matter. So if I go to product cards or cards, I can see the cards like this one. So you can use this for the title, for example, and then you also have the author. So we could go with that, or this one, or this one. So there are a bunch of options that we could go with. What I want to do is to show you this, but also to implement it myself, so you can also know what to look at when we are actually working with UI ourselves. So what I'm going to do is go back to our application and then create the component ourselves. So what we are going to do is in components, we can say something like book card.tsx. Here we can say RAFCE, and here we have the book card. Now what I want you to know is each book card in terms of SEO, it's better if we use an article because then it gets more priority in SEO as well, because each book contains a title, might contain a description, might also contain like the author and whatnot, and that is really good if you're using semantic HTML for this. So we have an article. Inside that we should have an h2 tag. I'm assuming that the page itself could have an h1, and then we have this h2 for the article, which says book title. Then you could also have the author, so you can use h3 book author, and then you can also have optionally the content if you want it, but I'm not going to keep that because we decided that our cards don't have any content right there, so just the title and the author. So now what I want to do is I just want to save this and use a book card or just render this. So I'm going to go to my pages book list, and inside here I just want to render it right here. So I'm going to create a UL, and inside that we'll have an li, and inside that we can render a book card, right? So if I save this now and I need to import the book card as well, then you'll see that now we have a problem. We have a div and we have a UL, which means we have two parent elements that can't work in React. So we need something called a React fragment, which is essentially this, and this makes it happy, and we are happy as well. Now that we have this, let's go to Beat, and you can see now book list, book title, book author, right? What we also want to do is in this book list, apart from this whole UL, we want to create a section because we might have more sections later on, and inside that we have this UL and the list itself. Now what I want to do is that in this UL, I'm going to render all of these cards in terms of a grid. So what I want to do is first style the card. So I can go here, say class name. Here we are going to say P4. So if I go here, you can see the P4 right here. Then we also have the BG. We can use a BG gray, and let's say, is it gray? No, it should be gray. And then we have, for example, 900. We have text white, and this is essentially how the card looks so far. Now, since we are using dark mode, this is how it looks. We could also go to light mode and see how that looks. So if I go to light mode, it looks like this. And now we can go to our code to make it even better. What we also want to have is something called rounded MD. So if I do this, you can see that now this is rounded, super cool. And now I can also say that the shadow is going to be MD. So if I save this, now you may or may not see the shadow itself. But what I can do is I can say shadow LG, and we also need to say shadow black, and that should render our shadow like this, right? And then we can also, instead of LG, keep MD or keep SM. So it's up to us what we want to do. We can also have something like hover, shadow, LG or MD, which means that if we mouse over, hover, shadow, MD, hover. Because if I have to do hover, shadow, MD, then I also have to do hover, shadow, MD, I don't know, red 500, shadow, red 500, and now this shows. So we have a default one, but then we have something on hover, which doesn't make sense. I'm not really sure if this is bug in Tailwind or not, but I'm going to keep it like this for now. All right, let's actually go forward with the title and this being centered. So I can just say text center, and that means both of the texts are centered. We're also going to have this gap between those two things. So I can give either of these a margin. So if I go here, I can say class name and MB4, which means margin bottom of 16 pixels. So if I mouse over this guy, you can see this orange thing. This is essentially the margin. So you can go to in elements, click this and mouse over. You can see there's a margin. This guy doesn't have a margin. So you can see it just like this. All right, now that we have this, also let's fix the text. So text should be LG for the book title. The book author should have a lower text font size. So class name, text SM. And now you can see this. This should also be text gray, something, something, to look a bit different. Now, since we are using the dark mode or the darker color, it doesn't show like that, but we are going to fix that as well, because in the light mode, this shouldn't be the case. So for the light mode, it should be, or we can say dark BG900, dark text white, dark, 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 dark. And that means that by default, this looks something like this. Okay, cool. And we also should probably use gray something, so it looks a bit nicer. So we have the book title, we have the book author, which means that this should be gray 700 or 800 for that matter. So if I use this, so it should look something like this. Otherwise, when it's dark, then it would look something different. So dark, text gray 300. Same goes with this one. So if I refresh now, you can see that this looks something like this. And if I turn on my settings and change it to dark, it looks something like this. Looks nice overall. So I think I'm going to go with this for now. Now that we have the book title and the book author, both of them right here, I'm just going to make sure that we are not really deleting anything. No, cool. So now that we have this, we are going to go to our component in the book list component, and we're going to quickly say, hey, UL, you're going to actually be a grid, and you're going to have a grid column 2 or grid column 1 in the beginning. That means that I can now loop over this. So I can say const books hard coded equals, and now I can just say, hey, I have a author and the title or the name for this, and we're going to go with that. Before that, I want to go to see what the books look like. So we have the ID, the title, and the author. So it's really good to have an interface created automatically or beforehand for this one. So I'm going to go and create an interface for this one. So let's create a folder. We're going to call this interfaces. And inside here, we can say book.interface.ts, and here export interface, book, and this has an ID that was a number. Then we also had the title of type string and the author of type string as well. Not SVG string, just this. Then what we can do is we can say, hey, this is going to be of type book array. And that means that now I can have the ID. So ID, I don't know, 1. We have title, let's say, and we have, for example, SN right here. No, first book. And then we also have, for example, the author. That could be SN. So if I save this right now, that means that I can loop over this. I lost the HTML I copied, but I can write it. So books hardcoded dot map, and in here I can have a book item, bool, book item, and in here I can just return the book card or an li containing the book card. So this is going to be an li, and here we have the book card being rendered. So this book item is not being used, but if I go to my page, you should be able to see that we should have one component. What happened? Requested module X does not provide export name default. What are you talking about? Is it because of this guy? Could be. Key book item.id. But if I refresh this now, looks good. I think it was just this variable not being used. So now that we have this, we can actually copy paste this and change the IDs a bit. So this guy, and then 2, 3, 4, and then we can also have the same thing. So oops, whoopsie, and this one 11, 22, 33, 44. All right, now if I go here, you can see that we have the book title and the book author as well. Super cool. If you see that on the big screen, it looks like this. Not really good if you ask me from a front end perspective. So that means that what we have said here right now is grid column 1. It changes with screen sizes. So you can say SM grid column 2, which means that in this particular situation is if I go from here to SM, this should change to column 2. Grid calls. Is it grid calls? Let's see. Grid calls is calls 2, and then this is calls 1, of course. There you go. And now you have 2 of those. And then you can also change it with MD, for example. So above MD, you can say grid calls 3, LG grid calls 4. Now this makes it really easy for us to just change them according to the screen size. So on a bigger screen size, you see 4 of them. Otherwise, you see 2 or 3, as we discussed. Now you can also add gap to that. So gap 4 means there's going to be a gap between those. If you remove that, no gap. If you add that back, we have a gap. Cool. So now that we have the grid columns sorted out, we can now render the actual book data from the API because we already have them. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, you see that we have first book. We can say, second book. We have third book. Let's keep it like this for now. But we don't show them. And for them to actually show, we want to be able to pass this book item to the book card, because the book card just says, hey, I'm a hard-coded book title, hard-coded book author. So this book card should be able to receive the book. This list should be able to pass the book. So if I go to exactly draw, this is what I mean. So in here, we have a situation. This outer box that you see right now, apart from the header and the footer, this thing right here, this is the book list page. This is the book card. The list page is the parent. So we have the list page, and then we also have the book card. The list page is the parent. The book card is the child component. List page has the array of books and each book. The book card does not have anything. So the book card is expecting that the list page, the parent page, is going to pass it down. That means that this list page that we are at right now, which has the books hard coded, which has each book item being looped into this map function, is supposed to pass this book item to the book card, as in item equals book item. But the problem is that this book card is not really accepting any attributes, because this is called a React prop, a property. So how do we pass this book item to the book card so it can actually render it? For that, this book card needs to say, hey, I'm ready to accept some props. So in here, you can define the props. You can say type book card props equals, and here you can say, hey, I'm going to receive an item of type book. Look at that. We are actually importing this from book interface. And that means that now I can say this book card is actually a React component, which we already know, but this is of a special type, which is a functional component. And you can import this FC from React. So import from React. This is how usually I write imports, and then I can get the IntelliSense. So FC, and this is of type book card props. This makes it much easier for us to just say props here, but then if I mouse over, the props should contain already this item. So I can go here and say props dot, and you can see the item right here. What is the type of the item? It's a book, which it says here. So now here I can simply say const book, not book, but item equals book, which means that I'm saying, hey, get book, sorry, not book, but props. And then that means that I'm saying props.item. What I like to do instead is to do this, which means I just break them down right here. And this still is valid. So if I mouse over, you can see the item is of type book, which it gives us. So yeah, we're good. Now here I can go and say, hey, for the title, I want to use item dot title, and you can see IntelliSense is helping me out here because of this type. And here for the h3, what I want is the item dot author. And if I save this and go to book list and save this guy as well, now you can see this is green, no problems at all. And now if I go to my application, you can see first book, second book, third book, and obviously the rest of them are just hard coded, so it makes sense. Now that we have that, we also want to say that the book item.id is supposed to be unique for the keys, which is okay. Now we can actually render based on the actual books that come from the API. So we are going to do that, and then we are going to add the ability to add more books. So first of all, this book's hard-coded has to go away. Nope, we are using actual API calls. For that, what we want to do is, what I like to do is, I want to have an API folder right here. And then here you can have a books API. So you can say books API.ts. And in here, you can create a class or you can create a constant. It's up to you. I personally like to create a class because then I can reference a bunch of stuff from that. So I can say class, books API, and in here, we have a base URL. What is the base URL? If I go to my extension for my backend or in my backend project, which is right here, you can see that the URL is localhost 3000/books. And you can see that the post and the get both are /books. So that means the base URL for this is localhost 3000/books. In a real world application where you're going to deploy this to production, this base URL should come from process env, but we are right now just going to paste it right here. So we have the base URL here, which is essentially HTTP localhost. Again, this should come from your env variables, but I'm just hard coding this. So localhost 3000/books. So this is the base URL, or you could call it API base URL. And then what we want to do is we want to then create some functions. So here you can say get books. This has to be an async function, which means that I can here say const response equals await. And here I can say fetch. What really? I can just say, hey, this should just say this.api base URL, which means that it's going to go to books and fetch the response. Then you can say const JSON response equals await response.json. This should be also awaited. And then we are going to send back the information. Now, if you go to the backend application right now, you're going to see that what we send back is a JSON object, is a JavaScript object, which has book, not this one, books as the key. So if I go to my browser, and here also you can see that the books is the key. So this is the JSON object. I don't want to send back the whole object. I just want to send back this array. So I'm going to just say, hey, not the entire books, but or not the entire object, but just the books key, which is an array. So if I go back to my code, I can say here that return JSON response dot, and here you can say books. Once we send this back, then we should be able to get the array of books. Now that we have this, we can say export default new books API. Now, when we do this, we are creating a single instance of this whole books API across the entire application. So whenever any file imports this file, they're just going to get one single instance of this. If I just do this, it doesn't work really well with the IntelliSense. So what I like to do is to do this const books API equals new books API. And then I can export this guy. And now, since I'm using a variable for this, the IntelliSense works fine with me importing this. So now I can go to books list. And in here, I want to actually get the entire array of the books hard coded. So what I can do here, I can just say this is an empty array. And if I go here, do a let, I'm going to show you something actually. Now that we have this, books hard coded is being used as well. What I want to do is I want to make the API call when the page loads, when the books list page is rendered. If I want to do that, I want to use a use effect for this. So a use effect allows us in React to do something when the component mounts, when the page renders. So if I do import from React, here I can actually import from React the use effect hook. And then I can use this, very important, please make note of this, with a dependency array that is empty. This means that this is going to run, or whatever I write here is going to run only when the component mounts, when the component renders for the first time. If I remove this, this code is going to run every time React re-renders this page, which is not what we want, at least not in this case. So here I want to make the API call and then render the UI. So what I can do here is that I can say, hey, books API, as you can see, it works well. I can just import this dot get books, which returns a promise, and I can use a then here response, or we will have the books array. And then here I can say, hey, books hard coded equals, and here we can just say books, right? Now you can see cannot assign to books hard coded because it's a constant. So we change this to let. Here you can see that this says a warning. From inside React hook, use effect will be lost after each render to preserve the value over time, stored in a use ref hook, blah, blah, blah. We'll see what happens. If I save this now and go to my application, let's see what happens. Here, if I refresh, nothing's happening really. So let's debug the code. You go to sources, you press Ctrl P or Command P, and then you can say books list.tsx. And now you can actually go ahead to this file and then click here to debug. Now, if I refresh this, you can see that we came inside this rendering part where it's trying to look at the books hard coded, which is an empty array, and is mapping. So nothing will happen. This code will never be executed unless we have something in the array. So if I play, now it came to books effect. If I click here, then it's going to try to go and get the information. So if I step into, now it's in the get books in the books API TS, which is the file where we have this class. Then it's going to try to get the response. So if I hit play with this URL, you can see that it should get back the data. We got a response which has a body, which is a readable stream. The status is 200. The status text is okay. If I go forward and parse this response JSON, then we should have the response object containing the books array, which has 2 items coming from the backend. And now I'm just returning the books array directly instead of the JSON response, which is an object containing the books array. So when we do this, it's going to come here with the books, and now I can assign this books to books hard coded, which means that then this should re-render and we should be able to see the books. But the reality is that that's not going to happen, and that is because React does not re-render the whole content if you have a normal variable. Boo! And the reason for that is that this is just a let, but React only re-renders if you have a state variable. How do we create a state variable instead? You do something like this. You say const books, and here you can say set books Now we can also say books array, set books array equals use state. So we do need a use state hook from React to create a state variable. By default, this is going to be an empty array, but afterwards we are going to use the set books array method to change the value from an empty array to actually the books that we got from the server. Now, in order to work well, we need to say that this is of type book array. Otherwise, it won't allow us to assign these values. So instead of using the books hard coded, we need to say set books array with the books that I've just got from the server. And instead of this books hard coded, I need to use the books array state variable that we have just used. Now I can comment this one out. So let's see what's happening. I said React, please create this books array state variable, initialize with an empty array, and then try to get the books when the component loads, because we are using the empty array here. That means once I've got the books, then I'm gonna use this set books array method to set the value of this guy. And as soon as I do this, this will re-render automatically because this is how React works. Now, I mentioned to add this guy. What happens if I don't do this? Then it will still work because it can see from the get books that the type coming from the promise is any. So we don't really set any sort of types, and that's why the value here becomes also never. Yeah, I don't think it works because then we have this ID and now it says never. So we need to tell this guy that this is going to be of type book array, which means if I now mouse over, this is a book. That means this book item is a book as well. So it's good to always set this like this. Now that we have this, let's save this, go to the books. It's going to try to render this. Now it's going to take the response. Then once we have that, it sends back the books. And now you should see the things rendering. So as soon as we change this from a normal variable to a state variable, everything is started to work. Super cool. And we are getting the same books from the network call. So you can go to network, you can filter it with fetch xhr, and here you see the books. So if I refresh this or click this, you can see in the preview or the response that these are the books that we are getting from the server. From the headers, general, you can see the request as well, of type get, super nice, cool. Now that we have this, let's quickly add the component to render a form that we can use to generate or to create a book. So for that, what we are going to do is we are going to add another component called add feedback form, or not add book form. So in here, I'm going to go and say add book form.tsx, rfce, remove this guy from here. And now what I want to use is something called the React form hooks. So if you go, or React hook form. So if you go to React hook form, you're going to find the get started, and from there you can see how to use this. So the first thing, of course, is to install this package. This form really makes it easier for us to work with it because it also provides some mechanism for errors and whatnot. So I'm going to use this one. So I can simply say npm install React hook form. We're going to install this package, installs really nicely, and now I can actually use it. I'm going to restart my server so I can use the newly installed package as well. Now that we have this, we need to create a form that we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy this whole snippet right here, and I'm going to use a fragment with the form, but then also a heading as well that says add book, something like this. Okay. Now you can see that we need some functions from this. So I could do it step by step, and let's do that. Actually, I'm going to actually remove all of this. So I think that would make things much easier for us. So we have a form, we have something that says add book. We need to use this inside our list page, and we need another section here. So we can say section. Here we can use the add book form, and we can import this from the components. Now, if I see here, you see the add book right here. So what I'm going to do is here, we can say class name. So I need to say it here. I can say class name. We can say max width SM. And then we can also say MX auto, which means that this is going to center it automatically, as you can see right here. Then what we want to do is for this add book form, we are going to have, I think I'm going to use a div to style everything instead of fragment. And then we have a heading and a form. So here what I can do is I can say class name, I can say BG. Since we are using light mode, we don't really need a form. So we can say border gray, something, something, maybe a 400. And now you can see a border just like this. We can also say rounded MD P4. So now you can see it's rounded. It has a padding. What we also want to do in the list is we want this section to have a margin bottom. So we have some space between these two. So we can say MB 8. And now you see we have this spacing right here. Now what we can do is also to give this guy a shadow, MD shadow gray, and we can take a gray of maybe 700. I do want to have the same shadow as this card. So now that we have this add book, let's add a style. So class name. Here we can say text to Excel. So we have a add book right here. And now we need the form inputs. So what I'm going to do is if I go to the Hyper UI Dev, you already now know how to work with some components. So I'm going to use this form to copy some input. Let's see if I can find a nice one. Maybe we can use this guy right here. So I'm going to go to view, and inside the form, we do have the label, we have the input. I'm just going to copy the input. We don't want the SVG or anything at all. So I'm going to quickly go to my code, and in here, let's paste this guy right here. This has to be changed to class name. And if I save this, go to my page, now you can see we have really nice little input. And if I also turn the dark mode, you can also see that this works really well with the dark mode as well, right? Cool, awesome. And the light mode as well. Cool, so I can just keep this light. Then what I want to do is I want to also have a gap between these two. So the heading that we have has to have an MB8 as well. So we have some space between that. And now we can change this. So input type text. This is going to be enter book title. So we can see that right here. Then we also should have another input that says text, but then this should be author name. And now we have the author name. Now you can see that they're pretty close. We don't want them to be this close. So what we are going to do is in the form, we can say class name, we can say flex. If we say flex, they are both going to be on one line. We don't want that. So flex column. And then we have on top of each other a gap of 4. So we have some spacing between those as well. And I think it looks really nice so far. Now that we have this, we also want to have some content written in them as well when we are adding a new book. So we can also add the same thing, but with a text area. So text area does not have a self-closing tag as far as I remember. So we need this. We need to remove the type. If I do this, you can see the enter author name. We don't want that. So in here, we can say enter book content. So here we have the book content right there. We can also say, I think, columns 3, if I can remember. Yeah. So this looks really nice, and this should be able to be expanded as well. All right, now that we have this really nice form, we can also add a button. So we can say button. Here we can say submit. I mean, we could also just copy it from the Hyper UI Dev. So let's go and pick some buttons. I don't want to go there. I want to see the buttons right here. Yes. Yes. So we can use not this one, maybe this one. No, this one. So I'm going to copy. I'm going to view this guy, and let's do if I go back here, this one. So I can copy this. I can go here. I will have to change this to button because I don't want an anchor tag right here. So this has to be a button. This has to be class name, no href. And if I just save this and go here, you can see the download button. Whoopsie, too much. Maybe do a P. I'm thinking now. If I do a margin MX 10, no. If I do MX 8, then it looks much nicer than what we had before. And instead of download, it should say submit. Now comes the interesting part. If I just hit submit, you're going to see that the whole page reloads, and that is the default behavior of the form. So if you enter anything like test, hit this, you can see that the page reloads. So we have to stop that. And we also have to do some other things as well, but we are going to look into that in just a bit. The first thing that you want to do is you want to have this button of type submit. That's the first thing. Then you also have to have on this form and on submit event that should call a function. So hit this should call add form submit, and this essentially takes the React event. So here I can say add form submit, and then here I get the event. So I can call this EV. This is going to be of type, if I can type this, so React submit. No, I think it's called submit event. And here I think we need to go to the documentation and see what do they use. So here they do use on submit, submit handler, inputs. So what we want to do here is I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go here to just create it on submit. We can just use on submit in here as well, or we could keep our function name, which is pretty nice to be honest. And then we can use submit handler, import React hook form. Now, this requires us to tell it what kind of inputs are we using. So we are using the title, we are using the author, and we are using the book content. So if you see here in the example, the types are right here. So what I want to do here is to create an inputs type, but I'll use the title and then the author string and the content string as well. The fun thing here is that we don't really use the content right here. So we also need to say content, right? And then we should be good string, unless it breaks something else. I don't think it breaks anything else so far. So now that we have this, we can use add form submit right here. And if I look at this code, you can see that in on submit, it calls handle submit. So we need to use the React form hook. So I'm going to use form and submit handler, both of them. Then I'm going to copy this guy and I'm going to create a hook right here. So this says, hey, create a form with these inputs, title, author, content. This function is used for registering each input. This handle submit is being used right here. So I need to say handle submit and then the function name. So handle submit. And inside here, I can use add form submit. Cool. The only thing that is remaining is, or two things. One is register. So we need to register each form with a name. So here we can use it just like this on the inputs themselves. So here on the input, I can say register title. Then the other one is register author. Because if I use anything else apart from what's in the inputs, it's not going to work. So I need to say the same name. So author, and the text area, of course, is going to be the content. Awesome. Now that we have those, we have actually registered this. Super cool. And now we can submit those and make them work. So if I submit this, this should console log the data. So if I am removing the errors, I'm not really using errors anywhere, but if I save this, does it crash? No. If I go here, refresh, I say test 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, test 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if I go to my console, submit, you can see the data right here, which is coming from add book form TSX. So blah, 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 test 1, 2, 3, 4, test 1, 2, 3. If I go right here, you can see that this comes from this code executing right here. But we want to make these things required. So if I go back to my the documentation here, you can see we can use the register with required true. So all the validation rules can be passed as the options right here. I'm assuming we can also pass minimum, maximum, blah, blah, blah as well. So the title is required. The author is also required, which should be like this. And then we have the content. This is not really required. So if I now try to go and do the same thing, you're going to see that nothing would really change. So test 1, 2, 3, this, you can see I can still log those values. But the question is the form valid or not? How can we check that? So we do have the errors that we can look at when it comes to the value. So errors.example required and blah, 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 this field is required. So what would happen is that the errors object will contain the same key if there's an error. So for example, this title is required, which means that now if I go for a span here, I can actually render this if we have an error. So I can say something like errors dot title. If there's a title error, then I want to render this span that says title is required. So here I can say class name text red. Maybe we can use this guy, and then we can also say my4. So if I do this, go here, submit this, remove this guy, you can see the title is required. So if I refresh the page, do nothing, nothing happens. If I hit submit, title is required. Yay, that makes sense. And now if I do this, you can see that we also don't get any logs. But if I say T or remove this guy, write this guy, and then hit submit, you can see nothing is really happening because yes, we don't have a valid form, so it doesn't even call that function. Super cool. The same thing can be done for the other one, but I'm gonna make sure that this looks good. So I'm gonna say text sm, and also this should be my2, so not too much. So title is required, looks nice here. Then we also should say this representing this here, and then we can say author, for example. So this one means error dot author, and then here we can say author is required. So if I refresh the page, try something, remove it, nothing happens. If I hit submit, you can see title is required, author is required, and then we have the other things as well. Alrighty, so this looks nice. We know that the form works, and with valid values, this should send, or this should trigger the function that is on submit. This is what we wanted. Now, instead of actually console logging, we now want to inform the parent component that, hey, go ahead and try to make the API call. And this is where things get a bit interesting. Previously, if we go to Exalitor, we had the situation where list page was a parent component. So this one was a parent component, and the book card was a child component in this case. So you can say parent, and the book card was a child component. And what we had to do was we had to pass the value of each book item to the book card so it can render it. Now the reality is that in the other context, we have add book form, which is also a child component, but this does not need a book item because this is about to create a book item. And what this wants to do is it wants to tell the list page that I have a potential new book. When it does that, the list page is supposed to have the communication between or with the server. And why I'm saying that is because we already have things in place. So if you look at the book list, it already talks to the book API. So should add book form have the API call right here? And here we get into the concept of smart components versus dumb components. Here we have a smart component, which is the page, which makes the API call. So it makes the API calls, it manages the states and whatnot. So this is the work of the smart component, this guy. The other ones are just dumb components. So this one is dumb components. And this one is also a dumb component. Why? Because the book card has no idea where is the book item coming from. It just gets it from the list page, which means that I can just pull this book card, put it anywhere on any page. If I can just give it a book, it's happy. In the case of detail page, the detail page is going to be the smart component, which is going to make the API call and get the data and manage it and somehow pass it to the book card. Similarly, the add book form should not make an API call because we should be able to just put this component everywhere, but we have to have some way for this book form to tell its parent component that, hey, please make an API call. So even though we want to have the communication from this guy to this guy, the flow still would be that the list page is going to send something to add book form, and that is going to be a callback method. So here it was passing a prop or is a property, which we call prop. This callback method is also a prop, which means that I'm passing a property, but that is not. In the case of book item, this property was an object. In the case of callback method, this property is a function. But the reality again is that this page has to send this add book form a function. So this can call the function and the list page knows, yay, we have something new. How do we do that? The same way as before. So just like we did with this book card, we created a type. We told React that this is a functional component that will receive this type, and then we were able to pass the item. Similarly, in the add book form, we are going to also create a add book form props, which is supposed to get a function, which means you should be able to say new book submit or add book form submit, something like this. So here we have add form submit, which we can use. So we can say new book submit. And in here, we can say that this is going to be a function which will receive a book, but it's not going to be the entire book. Why? Because at this point, we don't have the ID of the book. So we can't say that, hey, we are sending a book, because the ID has to be in the book. So instead, we'll say something else. But this does not return anything at all. So we are going to say void. Now, what is the type of this book? You could either say partial of book, which means that we can say that it's going to be partial of the book, which means that this book now can contain ID, may not contain ID, can contain title, may not contain title, blah, blah, blah. So every field is optional. Instead of that, what I want to rather say is I want to say omit book. And in here, I want to say that we are omitting the ID property. And that's pretty much it. So that means that this new book submit will have everything apart from the ID, which means content, title, author. Yay. The other thing also that we have now, since we have made this this whole content optional, it's not required here. That means that when we are sending the content to the API, we might have to send an empty string, or we make this required as well. So let's say if this was not required, then we could say content is this guy, which makes sense. Now that we have this, we can say that now this is a functional component from React. If I can find it, can I find it? No. So let's say import functional component from React, and this is of type add book form props, which means now I can say new book form submit is a function that's going to be provided. So instead of this console log data, I can say new book form or new book submit, receive the data. Super cool, easy peasy. Now, the only thing I want to have to do is that this new book submit should be passed from the book list, which right now doesn't. So here add book form basically doesn't pass anything. So we can say new book submit, create new book. So whenever this function is being called from here, we are going to call this function in the list component. So here we can say const this is going to receive a book of type omit book ID, and then all we need to do is this is supposed to be an async function, and this means that now we can say, hey, const created book equals await, and now we need to create a function that sends an API call to the server. So in our books API class, I can go ahead and say create new book. In this, we are going to receive a book of type omit book ID. And now what I can do is I can import the book interface. And in here, I can say, hey, this is going to be a fetch to the same API URL, but the method is going to be post. And then the response, once I get it, it sends back a book, not books. Because if I go back to my code of the backend, you can see that when we get the books, we get books. When we post a book, we get back a single book. So that's why I changed the code right there. Now that we have the book, we want to say the body that we are going to send is going to be json.stringify the book, which means that we are just sending the book without the ID. Then we get this back. Everything looks nice. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to just save this guy. And now here I can go and say books API dot create new book, passing the book inside. And that means I'm going to get the created book back. Once I have that back, I want to just add that to the books array on the very bottom. So I can say set books array, whatever we have already in the books array at the moment, plus the created book. So this just adds it to the end. And now that we have this, let's save this and try this out. So I'm going to go to my browser, go to my app, go to my sources, and in here I'm going to put some breakpoints. So this one is right here. And then we also have the books list, which is right here. Okay, let's see. So now if I say book title, SN, some content, that means if I hit submit, first of all, it comes inside the add book form to the new book submit. And you can see that the new book submit is something that we have passed from the parent. So as we discussed, this guy, the callback method, is the new book submit. We are passing it from the books list, which is right here. So we are saying, hey, new book submit, go inside. Whenever you're going to be called, we are going to call this function right here. So then the add book form, when we submit, it calls the new book submit, which in turn calls this guy. So we'll see that in a minute, or actually now. So now you can see that when we submit the form, it looks at new book submit, it picks the data, which is author, content, title. If I go inside, it goes in the book lists, create new book, because that's what we did. And now what you can also do is you can see that the books API create new book is being called. So from here, it goes to the API class, books API. And in here, now it's saying API based URL. I'm going to do a post. I'm going to send this guy the book, and then we'll see what happens. So then if I hit play, the JSON response right now is error. Please provide title and author both. Ooh, what's happening here? If I hit play, you're going to see that the network call gave back a 400 bad request, even though we're passing payload, which has the author, content, and title. So we're passing it. It doesn't see it for some reason. And the reason is that if you're just using fetch, we also have to set some headers. So in this API call, we also have to say headers. And in here, we need to add two headers basically. So content type is application JSON and accept application JSON. Once we have this, let's try this again. So now I'm gonna say test 1, 2, 3, SN, some content, and now if I try this again, 200. Look at that. And also we got test 1, 2, 3 right here. So if we look at the API now, you can see that we got a book back with the ID, and we sent the same things or similar things, but we now have everything working because we are sending the correct headers. You can also see in the headers that the request headers that we have sent contains the content type application JSON and also contains the accept here as application JSON as well. So now I can essentially just keep creating these books. And if I refresh, I still see them because now they exist on the server, and you can see that they all come back. Super cool. Now that we have them, we're going to just add one little thing, and that is if there's a content, we need to be able to get that on the other page. So what I want to do now is I want to go to the detail page and finalize this application. So what we'll do is we are going to go to our pages, and in the book detail page, we're already getting the ID. So for each page that we have in our list, what I want to do is I want to be able to click this and to go to the other page. Now, since this is not a link, this is a list item, I can implement the on-click manually on this one and have a function that takes us there programmatically. So what I can do here is I can say const, and in here I can say go to details, and in here I'm supposed to receive a book, And then what I should do is I should go to a particular page. So in this li, when I do on click, I need to call go to details. So I'm going to call this function like this. And I'm going to say go to details book item. All right. Then when we get the book, we should do some navigation. So for now, I'm just going to console log the book itself. So if I go back to my UI now, and if I refresh, go to console, let's go with hello world. You can see that we have the hello world being console logged. Test123, you can see we have test123, blah, blah, blah. Hello world 2, hello world 2. So now that we have all of these, we can actually go and use a hook that React router provides us that is called navigate. So I'm gonna go here, and instead of this, I can say const navigate equals use navigate, and we need to import this. So we can say import from, I think it's React router DOM, and this has a use navigate hook, just like this. Now I can actually use this navigate hook to go to a particular page. So here I can say navigate, and in here we have the two. So I can say backslash books slash, and now here I can give the ID. So I can use backticks instead and say book.id. And if I do this, save, then I should be able to go to the particular pages. So if I go and say go to details, if I click hello world, you can see that I came in this function. I have the book, which is hello world with the ID, and then I can use the navigate function with the book/book ID. If I hit save, you can see now we have book details, blah, blah, blah. Really cool. Instead of just passing the ID, we also have the possibility to not only go via a link, because if I go with just the ID now, then on the details page, I would have to fetch the particular book again. But I already have that here, right? I already have that on the list view. I have the entire data. What can I do better? And here you can also have something called a state, and the state can be passed. If I remember correctly, we have the navigate, which has the to and the options. As far as I remember, I can say the state here, and the state is going to be the book itself. So I can pass the entire book in that, which means that if I go to the book details page, I will see those. So in here, I can say const, and I think I can check the data from the location if I am correct. So if I do use location, and I think that also has to be from React Router DOM. Here I can actually get the state. Yeah, we have the state here. And then I can say that this state essentially is of type books. So if I do location, I can say this is called a book. And then here I can say, for example, I can render the book card here. So in this case, I can say, hey, I have a fragment, or I could also use a div, to be honest. So I can say div, and here I can say book card, and then I can render the item as in book. This means that I'm taking the state from use location, renaming it to book, and then using it right here. Okay. So now if I go to the detail page, let's go to list, and then I go to hello world 2, and now you can see hello world 2 here, because when we go to the book details page, and we can say book details, and if I put a breakpoint here, and if I go back, remove this, go here, now you can see that I'm going to details, and now you can see that the state, which is the book, contains the entire book right here in the details page. So I can just pass this into the book card, and the book card gets rendered. Super cool. Now what we can also do is in the details page, we can also go ahead and render the content as well. So here we can then have a section inside which we can have a p tag, and the p tag can render the book.content if the book has a content. So in here, then I can remove the ID and the use params because we don't need them. And then I can refresh this. And now you can see that there's no content. But if I go to the last ones, I think we had some content. So like some content is right there. So you can see that as well. So I can go back to my code. And in here, we can have a class name, flex call, gap 4, or gap 8, to be honest. And then we can see this content right here as well. So now we have that whole thing figured out. What happens if I refresh the page? You can see that React Router somehow caches this and we still see that information automatically. If I go to network disable cache, you can see that it still has that information because the React Router passed that. So it's keeping that information somewhere. What happens if I try to go to a particular page which I have not opened before? For example, I don't think I've opened this one yet. Now I have. Maybe if I create a new one, so a new one, Muhammad Ehsan Ayaz, and some content that's amazing. That's amazing. So if I do this, then I get to an ID which is right here, and the ID should be right here. So if I go to books slash this, you can see that it breaks because the first time it comes here, it doesn't have anything at all. But if I go back to my list page, and now if I go to new one, now you can see some content that's amazing. And if I refresh now, boom, there you go. You have this, even though if I'm refreshing, it works. What happens if I go to the application and clear everything? So if I go to storage, I say clear site data, and if I refresh now, you can see that it's keeping it somewhere. So I haven't figured out where it's keeping it, but I will. Trust me. Now that we have this, we can add more content. We can go to a particular page, and we can also implement, for example, an API that returns us information when we actually have an ID and we want to get things by ID. So instead of having this state thingy, we could have a view where we can just take the ID from our particular route and then just use that. So I'm going to bring back the ID just like we had before. So we are not losing track of it because I think it is still useful for you. So I'm going to keep it like this and just like this. And there we go. Awesome. So if I go to my page, I should still be able to have the ID. So this is how it looks overall. We do have the details page implemented and also the list page implemented. And finally, obviously, we also want in the header. So if I go to the header itself, your logo should always take you to the home page. So in here, you can essentially use a link tag that takes you to the home page. So here, I think we also have a link tag from the React Router DOM, if I'm correct. So I can do import from React Router DOM. And this should be a link tag. Yep. So I can use a link and then the span inside. And this should be href, or is it 2? I think it's 2 backslash. So now if I go here, refresh, did I stop my server? No. So if I refresh now, it says cannot destructure property base name of use context. It is null. Oh, now I understand. So the thing is, the header itself is not inside any router, which is a problem. So we can't have the link right here. So we need to change the app TSX to have it in a way that it comes under the browser router. So I would have to do something like this. So browser router containing all the magic, including the header, including the footer, including the main, and then having the routes inside. I'm hoping that's what it wants me to do. And if I remove this guy, this should be happy. Everything should ideally work as it should. So refresh, it works. Going to the detail page, that works. Going back, that works. Going to the detail page for this one. And clicking this takes us to the home page. Yay! One thing in terms of UI is if I mouse over this, I don't see any feedback, which is not really good UX or UI. So what we should do rather is if you are on a book card, it should have a cursor pointer. So cursor pointer, just like this, which means now you see my cursor changing. Previously it was not. Secondly, you also want on hover this to translate a bit. So translate Y maybe 2. If I do this, you'll see, boom, these are going down a bit. What I want to do is to do it upward. So a negative Y. No, I think it's not this, but minus. So now they go upward, but you can see that they're really snappy for some reason. So we use a duration of 200. And now you see that they're pretty nice. And we can also say things like, I don't know, maybe add a shadow that's a neon. So you could do something like hover, shadow, SM, hover, shadow, indigo, and 700 or 800. Let's go with 800. So like these ones, they're pretty subtle. Now they're not. So now you can see, whoop, they look super nice, right? And now you can click this one, and this one also does it. So this is essentially what I wanted to talk in general. What I'm going to do is maybe we'll have a different video about how to deploy to GitHub pages, but you will see the content or the links in the description of this video as well. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel. And if there are topics that you want me to cover in depth, let me know in the comments. And as always, happy coding. I'm going to see you in the next video.